Good morning and welcome to a spotlight on the originals. My name is Kate. I work with the Seva Foundation, and we're very happy to have you here today. Before we get started with our conversation, I wanted to make sure that those of you listening this morning had a sense of what's ahead and could plan. Firstly, the session is going to be recorded, so we'll be sharing this with you via email after the session this morning, and you're more than welcome to share it with your friends or family members that maybe weren't able to join us live. Secondly, we're also going to be having all of you on mute. There's several hundred of you this morning. We think close to 400, frankly. And what we'll do for your questions and answers are that you'll be asked to go into the chat room function and type in your questions, and we'll do our very best to get to every one of them. If we can't get to it live, we will come back to you on email so that you can have an answer to your important question. We'll also have about 30 to 35 minutes of the originals in conversation, and then we'll open up the remainder of the session for your questions. So we're hoping that we're really giving you ample and generous time to ask a question that you might have. So let me start by first welcoming you on behalf of the staff and the Board of Trustees at the Seva Foundation, and maybe take a moment to explain why the originals, why that name. And I want to be clear that this is actually something we as staff refer to for a group of individuals that span multiple decades that we think really were essential in helping to develop who we are today. When I was looking for inspiration, I actually just went to the dictionary. And when you look at an adjective definition, it talks about original is created directly and personally by a particular artist. That couldn't be more true. And then the second one, a noun definition, is an eccentric or unusual person. Well, we have three of the many originals with us this morning. But before I do their introductions, it's worth noting that one of our originals who had been intended to join us this morning is unable to do so because of a health issue. She's doing fine. Jahanra is unable to join us, but she will join us for another original conversation. We hope that this series will be part of a series that we offer throughout the next couple of years, so that by the time it's finished, there's a whole collection of these conversations so that everybody can benefit from the rich fabric and rich storytelling of Seva. So without further ado, I have the pleasure of introducing the three originals that are with us today. I'm going to begin with Suzanne Gilbert. Suzanne is a respected innovator with 40 years of experience designing and scaling comprehensive, equitable eye care services in Asia, Latin America, and Africa. Suzanne is a co-founder of the Seva Foundation, which, along with partners, has restored sight to over 5 million people. Since Seva's founding, Suzanne has played various roles within Seva, including being one of Seva's first volunteers, an executive director, program director. She currently serves as our senior director for research and strategic opportunities, based here in Berkeley, California. Our next original is Girija Brilliant. Girija received her doctorate in public health from the University of Michigan. Her work in India and Nepal helped identify gender as a critical factor in preventing rural populations from using available eye care services. Along with her husband, Larry, she co-founded the Seva Foundation, whose projects have given back sight to 5 million people. She also is actively involved in the India smallpox eradication project. Girija is on the board of Camp Winter Rainbow and served as an advisor to the Muslim Women Fund. Girija is trained as an Iyengar yoga instructor and is also a Buddhist practitioner. She currently is on the Marin County Commission on Aging and serves as a liaison to the Marin Interagency Disaster Coalition. You're busy these days, Girija. And finally, Mirabai. Mirabai Bush teaches contemplative practices and develops programs by applying contemplative principles and values to individual and organizational life. She has co-founded and led 3 organizations: Illuminations, Inc., Center for Contemplative Mind and Society, where she is now a senior fellow, and the Love, Serve, Remember Foundation. Mirabai works as an emerging 21st century intersection of industry, social healing, and diverse contemplative practices. She designed Google's popular employee program, Search Inside Yourself. And her life is a fascinating narrative of our time, a rediscovery of contemplative practices in many forms and from many traditions, all within the secular thick of modern culture. She's a gifted author, including Contemplative Practice and Higher Education, and with Ram Dass, Walking Each Other Home, Conversations on Loving and Dying. She's a Seva co-founder, and yes, also a Seva original. So welcome, each of you. So I'd like to get us the conversation started with what might be a simple question, but what drew you to Seva?
Well, what drew Larry and I to create Seva was the continuing inspiration of having seen the last case of smallpox and having worked with really inspiring and dedicated people from all over the world. And once you taste that kind of dedication and sort of exuberance in doing good work in an excellent manner, doing skillful work, we really missed that. And even though we were back in an academic setting, we were longing to find another way to work with other originals, as you described them, and find something new to do. So out of that is the desire to call a meeting, and that is the one that we've seen pictures of. There's a picture here of, that was the first time we had a meeting in California. Our first meeting was in Michigan. And what was interesting about this meeting is that before that, we had a scientific gathering to understand the issues of blindness in Nepal. And Seva, from the very beginning, was able to bring together science and service. And I think I'll stop with it. If that picture comes up, you can just take a look at the huge variety of who we were.
We have a lot of those pictures here in the office, and we're always, Suzanne, as part of our staff meetings, will do a segment called "What's That Seva Stuff?" And so if that comes up, we'll be able to talk about it. But Suzanne and Mirabai, from your perspective, what drew you to Seva?
Suzanne, you take it.
Okay, good. Well, thank you so much. And Kate, we really appreciate being invited. And of course, we sorely miss Jahanara not being able to be with us today. But just to really echo and build upon what Girija said, I, from my early college years, was very interested in international development. And I put a lot of effort into learning about what's going on around the world, and how to prepare to be part of a global community working to bring equity to everyone. But the more I got involved in programs, especially in India and Nepal, I realized at this time in the 1970s, many of those programs were very driven by expatriate developers and not by the local people. Mm-hmm. So actually, by the time I was only 25 years old, I was already kind of turned off to working internationally, where there was a very inequitable relationship between groups coming in with funding and groups who knew the needs and knew what to do. And I'd kind of given up on doing international development work until at the University of Michigan School of Public Health in the late 70s, I met Larry and Girija, who were just back from smallpox eradication. It became clear that they had a vision of a way of working as a global community in a light, non-bureaucratic way that would enable us to really make a difference as being a catalyst and being an ally with people who were very local to specific needs. So I was attracted to just this whole approach. I worked with Girija in setting up our founding meeting, and just was very open to whatever the organization would become, knowing that it would be a community of service.
Yeah. Equity. I've heard you share that story before, and I think it's really that's going to be a book we're going to have you write, Suzanne, in the future, I think. And Mirabai, what about you? What drew you to Seva?
Well, many of you probably know that Larry and Girija were with a teacher in India, Nicole Grasse, and that is where I met Girija. And I had been a PhD student in this country, and I had was in 1969 and 70. It was a very difficult time here, like it is now, and I went traveling around the world looking for a way of being that made more sense than what I had been experiencing, and I found my way somehow to this teacher, Nicole Grasse, who was extraordinary, and he was very simple, and his message was only. His message was only love people and love everyone and serve everyone. And so I came back to this country trying to figure out what that would mean in contemporary life. And so I was running a business called Illuminations, which later made the Seva Rainbow. And I was doing it as a kind of right livelihood. But one day Larry showed up, and I still remember sitting on the back porch, and he was talking about how Seva was just beginning. And it sounded wonderful to me. I couldn't imagine really being part of it because I was busy running a business. But Larry asked me if would I be a friend of Seva and then be on the board of Seva. And as it turned out, Illuminations ended a certain couple of years in, and I became an active board member then. And and it was for me a clear way to act out what this amazing teacher of ours told us to do, to love everyone and serve everyone. Also, I had been in India and Nepal for a few years on this journey, and like others of us, wanted to in some way give back, not just to the many teachers I'd met there, but to the people and the cultures themselves who had created an environment for us to go through all the changes we went through there. And so the idea of giving back to Nepal made me really happy.
Right.
Yeah, I just wanted to throw in a historical fact, which is when I first was in India and I was taking meditation courses. In my very first one, I met Mirabai Bush. And it was through Mirabai and her husband that I came to meet Nicole Grasse, and then later brought my husband to meet him. And so through that sort of connection, that causal link, so many years later, brought us all together. And I think it's important for the people listening to know that in life, things sort of seem random in the way you meet people, and one thing leads to something else, and things can unfold in really subtle and surprising ways. So actually, Mirabai is the reason that so much of my life happened the way it did. So deep bows to you, Mirabai.
Oh. Well, Mirabai, I'm wondering. Let's stay a little bit. I want to get to the science in a minute and the equity, but I'm curious what you feel about contemplative activism and whether or not you saw that as a big part of Seva's journey or the success in the founding. And the reason why I'm wondering is because you authored a book, Compassion in Action, and that was actually the book that I read when I was interviewing for this job, and I was hooked. And I know that you co-authored that with Ram Dass, but that philosophy for me is really is Seva's fabric in many ways. And would you mind kicking off a little bit more of a deep dive on that and what you were doing there?
Well, we wrote the book after There's Ja. She is with us.
All right, hello.
Yeah, and there's our book. And one of the things Ram Dass did for Seva, many things, but one was that he raised a lot of money. He went around the country giving talks. One tour, I mean, I used to say it was 90 cities, maybe it was 60, I forget. But it was like he'd go from place to place and he'd stay in like the Days Inn in each place. And he would give a talk and people would each pay $10 or $15 and then he'd give all the money to Seva. But what became, and when he talked about Seva, but he also talked about the message from our teacher to love everyone and serve everyone. And at that, Ram Dass was very popular in those years. He had written Be Here Now in 1970, and it sold over 2 million copies. So it seemed like everyone was reading it, and that message was in there too. It was also a time when people were trying to figure out ways with integrity to lead their lives. I mean, people are always trying to figure that out, but it was a big conversation at the time. And not many people of the folks who came to Ram Dass were activists. They were focused on looking for a spiritual practice and whatever else they were doing. And so as Ram Dass spoke and talked all about Seva, people wanted to find out what they could do, what kind of service they could do. And so that led us to write this book. And it was really based on the principles on which Seva was founded. And what we tried to do in Seva was bring together the inner life of waking up in a whole range of ways. The board in the first years was a very, in some ways, diverse group of people, but certainly in terms of what our spiritual paths were. And they were, I mean, there was a Catholic nun, there were some of us who had discovered Hinduism and Buddhism, there were people with roots in Catholicism and Christianity and Judaism, and people, and there was Danny Rifkin, who grew up as a red diaper baby and didn't have any, quote, religious or spiritual practice, but was a person committed to waking up. And so we all wanted to bring that into the way in which we did the work. And we did that in a lot of different ways. But the main way it manifested was in the board meetings, where we would share with each other what was, we would do different practices, and then we would share what was really going on with us. What were we learning? What was challenging us at the time. And we had these famous circle sharing, which we'd go around, and sometimes it took a really long time. And sometimes we really questioned whether we should be spending our time that way. But in fact, it developed in us an honesty about what was really mattered. It uncovered our deepest motivations for doing this work, not just, meeting some goals we had set. And also it built trust. And I know that was so important. We were able to make decisions over the phone about major changes or major budget items really quickly, because we knew each other so well. We trusted each other, and we knew if Larry or Girija or Suzanne said something, we knew where that was coming from and what was behind that, and we could trust it or challenge it, So that was a really important difference in Seva from other organizations, particularly organizations for social change. And it's spun off since then into many, many other organizations. Does that help?
So that reminds me of Johanna, who is not here today, but at one of our meetings, she came and said, well, I know Seva is doing blindness work, but I really want us to work in Latin America, and here's the experience. Here's who I met. I think it's really, really important. It was completely different than anything we were doing at the time, but we knew Ja and we respected her passion and her heart. And because of that, we said, we'll support you.
Yes, yes, that's a great example.
Talking about.
I would say, well, it is a great example, and I think it's, well, first, a couple of quick things. We still do the circle shares today, Mirabai, and I think the staff today and the board has the same question about whether or not, because they serve the same purpose. I think that there's a way of us connecting in a way with one another that, because of being professional and trying to be, when you're in social justice, you're really, everything you do when you wake up in the morning is because you're trying to make something better for somebody that you haven't met. And oftentimes you forget to slow down and connect back into the very person you're working shoulder to shoulder with in order to make those kind of changes. So that discipline, that practice is something we still do today for very similar reasons. And there are times when we question whether or not it's the right thing, but I believe it's really stood the test of time. But earlier we talked about, and I think even in the Ram Dass Memorial, there was the conversation around the tension between the doers and the beers, and the wonderment I have is around science and the science aspect. And you know, I know that a lot of the originals have the curious scientific mind as well as a contemplative patience and heart. But for me, what I find really remarkable about Seva is that blending of the two, that there's this joy and compassion, but it's rooted in really great science. And Girija, I was just curious if you had any thoughts around, you know, was this something that was organic and natural from the beginning, or was it kind of a weird thing to kind of knit together?
Well, when our guru, Neem Karoli Baba, and he sent us off to work in the smallpox program, we would come up on weekends and we would have basically debriefings, and he would ask about where was the disease, suggest ways to deal with it and address it. And it was certainly very precise and in some level fact-driven, and another level very cosmic, but I never felt there was a contradiction. And working in the smallpox program where numbers was so important, where truth and data was so important, because today cases were being hidden, people weren't really talking about how things were. So we understood how important it was to have good information and to make sure everyone had that same information. And so when we came back to the States after the smallpox program, Larry and I both wanted to get more training in public health because we'd kind of fallen into it. And so that's where I met Suzanne. That's where we were all honing our skills in public health and data management as we began Seva. The natural marriage of the two. Also because Suzanne and I were getting our PhDs, and you're always looking around for it. Because in those days, a woman with just an MPH had no power or no authority in any program. And the same probably true for men, but we knew that a PhD was kind of the minimum requirement to have a seat at the table in global health. And in grad school, when we began Seva, those things happened at the same time. And Dr. V was an integral part of our deciding what we were going to do our doctoral work on, how were we going to focus our research. So there was never, for me, a separation of the two. And I was blessed to have Nicole Grasse and Dr. V as mentors, people who really, really helped me focus on really good science for a really good cause. So I've never felt any conflict in any way.
I wonder if we could bring up a picture of Nicole Grasse with Larry and Girija and Dr. Parra. It's a black and white photo from 1980-81.
Well, if it comes up, you'll see the historic Apple computer. It's kind of a legendary one.
Yes.
To use in the Nepal survey. And years later, after Seva's some anniversary party, I don't know if it was 35th or something.
35, our 35th anniversary party.
The same computer to show the picture and bring it to Steve's wife, and say this was the computer that we used that helped us find out where there was blindness in Nepal.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, Steve Jobs' original funding, but even more important, his contribution to the technology of the Nepal Blindness Survey in 1980-81 was just a huge game changer for enabling us to see data as it was coming in from 105 survey sites. It was just a remarkable opportunity. And Girija mentioned Dr. Nicole Grasse, who was such a force
She was
behind.
Mary's boss in the smallpox program. She was the person who ultimately decided to hire him as a typist and editorial assistant until they could find a job for him. And
We're getting a little family album here. Here just spoke of Dr. V, Dr. G. Venkateswamy, who, when he participated in the founding of Seva in 1978, he had only just started his own eye hospital, a little hospital based in his family home called the Aravind Eye Hospital, which today has become one of the largest eye care systems in the world, the Aravind Eye Care System. But Dr. Venkateswamy brought such curiosity about how this group of people who were getting together, who invited him to this meeting in the middle of winter in the snow in Michigan to found an organization. He was very interested in how we were going about it. And one little story I'd like to say, and again, this is to me symbolic of so many of Seva's friends and partnerships. When Dr. Venkateswamy came to our founding meeting, many people who had just started a program would come with a whole list of funding needs. No, Dr. V came with two requests. He said, I need to find someone, you must help me, find someone who can administer the hospital, manage it so beautifully that it has the legs to grow. And then he also said, and we also need a person who can help us develop a satellite system, really help us understand the management principles. And so the key ways Seva assisted Dr. Venkateswamy in the beginning, when it was maybe 12 family as staff, was by providing people who were just remarkable and who he could mold, as he would say it, and grow into very effective change agents, not only for Aravind, but for the world.
so one of my most treasured possessions is a little postcard that I wrote on my first visit to Aravind when our son was not even 1 year old. And I saw his first hospital. And on the postcard to Ja, I wrote, I think we can really do something with Dr. V.
That ended up being a very prophetic postcard, Girija.
Yeah. But and I mentioned the relationship with Dr. Venkateswamy, and now over the 40 plus years, the very growing set of relationships with literally hundreds of Aravind staff and supporters, as a very important part of how Seva worked and continues to work in terms of working through partnerships, knowing, recognizing, and trusting the enormous competence and insight of partners, and bringing what we can from Seva to supplement that. Part of that is money, of course, very important, but a lot of it is just having a creative space to explore.
And I would just say to the people listening in, when we first met Dr. V, he was wearing Birkenstocks with socks and an oversized winter coat, and he looked to be such an unassuming person that one could have just looked right past him, until you had the time and the occasion to really work with him. And so it's just a reminder of when you meet people to always take a moment to have a sense of who they really are in whatever form they're taking.
Mm-hmm.
Profound.
He was not charismatic in the sense of a great speaker, as Ram Dass was. He was charismatic spiritually. You could sit in a room with Dr. V, and you were aware of this force that was helping manifest things. So people bring their different gifts to the Seva Circle.
There it is.
Yes, and you know, one reason we love this picture taken at Larry and Girija Brilliant's house was it just brings together the joy shared across the four of us, Ram Dass, Dr. Venkateswamy, Mira, and I. And this was in the middle of probably, we probably just came out of a full week-long Seva board meeting, and we were doing follow-up. We stayed together another week to kind of pull together the strands of all the richness that had come out of the meeting that would be translated by staff into program. And we so enjoyed that Dr. Venkateswamy was able to come to the States for several weeks at a time every year, anchored by the Seva meeting, and then also gave us a great opportunity to experience with and through him so much of the medical system in the United States and meet such amazing people. So Ram Dass and he had a very special relationship. I know everyone at Aravind really recognized that.
When he'd stay at our house, Dr. V was a student of Aurobindo who was a very prolific writer, and he always wanted Ram Dass to come at 6 o'clock in the morning and sit and meditate with him on our front porch. And so Ram Dass would somehow manage to get there, but they had such a loving relationship. And I'm also looking at the t-shirt and thinking that that's something that you helped design, Mirabai.
Yeah, we made that t-shirt at Illuminations, as I remember, the one with the teepee.
The teepee t-shirt. In fact, Mirabai, as treasurer and chair of Aravind during all those years, you and your team, Mirabai, you designed a t-shirt for every meeting. So just imagine, you know, back in the 80s, putting all these things together and, oh, while we're at it, let's design a new t-shirt and bring one for everybody, guessing our sizes. So that was just another one of the ways that Mirabai, in her enormous generosity and focus on gifting and supporting people, was so prominent, and something I've learned so much from, and others in Seva as well.
I was thinking you had to kind of a throwaway phrase when you were talking about Dr. V, when you said, and then we just finished a week-long meeting, and then we stay for another week. And now I'm on 4 other boards, and people often say, you know, some version of how can our board be more like Seva's was. And then I tell them, well, we had 2 meetings a year. One was for 2 weeks, and one was for 1 week. And we lived in teepees while we did it. I remember sorting out slides on the ground in the teepee. And then they usually say, well, let's go on to the next thing. Yeah, we were committed.
Also true. If we can find that slide of us in the Seva meeting in the teepee, that'd be great to show.
Yeah, there's a shot. It's in color, and it's just showing part of the Seva circle in a big top or circus tent at Camp Winter Rainbow at Black Oak Ranch in Mendocino, California. And it really does help to have a board meeting under a circus tent. I highly recommend it. And we did that for many, many years. People would fly in from all over the world, and then we'd have our carpool set up, and we'd drive 3.5 hours north to Camp Winter Rainbow from the San Francisco airport and just be on our own. I mean, this was before cell phones, and even when cell phones started coming in, there was very little coverage. In fact, there was one payphone, and Jahanra at her Camp Winter Rainbow office had one phone. And it was wonderful to be cloistered. Back then in the 80s and early 90s, when you were somewhere, you were there because you weren't part of this onslaught of all this other data flow and distraction. And so we could really be together. But it lent an ambiance, and it gave us space, and the whole forest area and teepee circle were very, very central to Seva's work, which is one reason Mirabai designed that t-shirt featuring one of the teepees.
Great. Here we go.
Yeah, this is just a slice of life. We have colleagues here from India, Nepal, Guatemala, US, Canada, multiple other countries, bringing their views, their essence to discussion of the work that enriched it so much.
And we were young.
We had the time to do that. And the reason, as our families grew and our jobs grew, and some of our board members went on to train as physicians and open practices, and we had other constraints on our time. But this was really special time for all of us.
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, as we start to, we're going to get ready to take questions in about 2 minutes here. I wanted to take a moment and do two things that maybe brings us a little bit more into the work of Seva today. And one is I'm going to use your work, Mirabai. I know you developed something called the Gifts of Service Catalog, even before I think fair trade terminology came to mind. And do we still have a picture of that first catalog? But this was a way of helping people who might want to connect in with the Seva Foundation and the mission and the work. And what I think is so remarkable about philanthropy, not only does it literally mean for the love of humanity, but it's a way of saying you help to amplify my values. So the gift isn't to us, it's through us for the purpose of affecting change in the world. This is it. So this was, I think, the very first Gifts of Sight, and it's a way that we currently work with our, we still have a product like this today that we use for alternative gifts, non-material gifts. And what I wanted to do is I segue to the last question around my question to all of you, and as I'm teeing up this question, I'm going to give you a moment to think about it, and I'm going to ask Rolando to do me a favor. Can you pull up the first poll? I think before we go into questions, I'm kind of curious to get a sense of who's on the call today. So we're going to have a poll available to you. You can go to your computer. It's a simple question. You can answer what applies to you. We're wondering for how long or in what decade did you join or become associated with Seva? And I think the wonderment that I have for you, Suzanne, is around what are you seeing as the through line? What's the through line in terms of the work in terms of today? We've heard a little of the science, the equity, the contemplative practice, the truth in data. What Girija just said, I think might become a tattoo that I use at some point in my life. But what do you see as the through line? Do you feel that, you know, how do you feel about the work that we're doing today? Do you see a lot of, have we successfully brought forward pieces of who we've been to who we're emerging into and evolving into? Or do you feel like it's changed radically?
Oh, thank you, Kate. Well, as we all know, over 40 plus years, everything changes to some extent. Right. What I see through Seva, though, along with your question, Kate, is a very distinct through line. I think of our founding meeting. I think of the early decades of work. I think of hundreds and actually thousands of people who've enriched Seva and made it possible. And I think the characteristic that to me remains very important, and I think is the foundation of our continued work and our expanded work, is our deep listening, for what are the needs and who's out there who's capable to make a change. What data are available? How can we participate with local communities in developing the ability to collect data and learn for themselves? Also, the fact that Seva works in community, and that has not changed at all. I mean, Seva is a catalyst as an organization and a convener. And so whether it was having week-long board meetings that involved 60 people coming in, or whether it's a relatively smaller synergy session that Seva might have today over the course of a full day, what we're doing is very actively convening people, not just to connect the dots, but rather to really help people establish a whole new way of looking at the work and how they can make it happen.
Yeah, I appreciate it. That's something that I know when I've tried to be very intentional and thoughtful around, you know, entering into this particular position. Even though I spent 35 years of my life in international relief and development work, part of what drew me to Seva, and I said this, I think, even in the interview with you, Suzanne, and the rest of the board, was I really felt a sense of coming home because of the fabric of what I noticed about the work. And and what I felt were almost concentric circles of good. And there's a term Mirabai and I share. I also grew up Catholic. That's not my practicing thing now, but there's something called an absolute good. And when I started to look at the work and the way that Seva worked, and I remember my first trip to India and looking at the mid-level ophthalmologists, that crowd of magnificent, mostly women who were being trained, I thought to myself, this is a more effective job creation program than anything I had ever been associated with when I was working for the US government or for anybody else. So at some point, and we don't have to talk about it right now, but I have one of the elephants in the room is that, I think back in the day around, what was it like? I know I've seen plenty of photographs where either the three of you or Jahanra and others, you were oftentimes as women in the minority. And I think before we show the poll results, I just wanted to have a sense of, I know that it's not something you wear necessarily on your sleeve, but what was that ever a topic for discussion amongst yourselves around, coming to almost for me, Suzanne, when you talked earlier about what you didn't like about potentially, development work, there's been an emergence around feminization of development work that really takes a path that you're talking about.
Yeah.
So
Well, one thing I wonder if we could see an image. There's an image from a very important meeting that was hosted for Seva by the National Eye Institute in Bethesda.
Yes.
I wonder if we can find the photo. It's 30 people standing on a staircase. It's very vertical. But I think in a way that when we do see it, what we'll recognize is, particularly in the earlier decades of this work, there were very few women in leadership. I mean, this is a meeting that Seva's very delighted was hosted.
Three of us.
Yeah.
And there are the three of us. There's Girija, Mirabai, and myself in the front, along with Tulsi Raj from Ireland, and so many colleagues from Nepal, and
Look at Larry
Green, who's still with us as a consultant, and Dr. Marty Spencer and Dr. Dick Litwin, and Larry Brilliant in the front, and many key colleagues, too numerous to mention. But the issue here is, at almost every meeting I attended at the top U.S. government levels or at the World Health Organization levels as a representative for Seva, I was usually one of one or two women in the room who was not there in a purely clerical role. And so I think one of the things that's been very important to Seva is recognizing the importance of equity of all kinds, including gender, and also making sure in our work, including in our training activities, which are such a huge part of Seva, that we make sure that training is appropriate and accessible to women as well as to men, and also developing women leaders within our Seva staff and our partners. Very important.
So in the smallpox program, Nicole Grasse, who you saw, was the only woman who had any role, any professional title in all of the WHO office in India. Everyone else would have been secretaries or receptionists. She was the only woman who had that position to run a program. And because of that, she was a fabulous mentor to all the women in Seva. And she didn't feel the need to sacrifice the things that she enjoyed doing in order to be an effective woman in Seva. But I will say, in the early years, there were three key members of Seva who were academics and professional speakers, and they happened to be men. And I think oftentimes their voices would be the ones that we heard first when people were talking about Seva. And I think it took a while for the women in Seva to really make sure that our voices were heard. We were certainly doing a lot of the work, but oftentimes we were quieter, and I think that has changed for the better.
Yeah, I was remembering that. I mean, this is so, this event is so quick that we haven't even mentioned the work in Guatemala. I spent 10 years doing that. But the interesting thing here about it was that it was all done by women. Ja started it, and Ja and Sunanda and I, with visits from others of the women in Seva, ran it for all those years. And we were in a world, a traditional Guatemalan world, not the Hispanic Guatemalan world. We worked mainly with Mayan people, and in villages. And there we would be, and of course, it was all very male dominated. And so we would say, well, we really think you should get the women involved in this or that decision making, you know. They said, oh, no, we couldn't do that. And then I remember one day we sat back and we said, guess what? You know, if women hadn't tuned in to your desperate situation and felt compassion and wanted to be here and help you rebuild your communities, it wouldn't have happened. And they were like, I guess you're right. Maybe we should bring the women in. So that was the beginning of a change in a, 1,000-year-old culture.
Well, this is a good opportunity. Let's go ahead and let's publish the results of the poll, and then let me kick it off. Amy Schurtz, who's a former Seva staff member, I think she worked for Seva about 15 years. So the majority of the people on the call are 20 or more years. We've got a couple of brand new folks joining us. Welcome. You 0 to 2 years, folks. The 2 to 5ers, I'm in your category. So this is a wonderful opportunity to just reflect on, again, the fabric of Seva. So one of the questions that came in from Amy was around Guatemala, and maybe let's take a few minutes to talk about it, because as some of you know that might be focusing and listening and watching for what Seva is all about, one of our bold ideas for transforming lives is an idea about is revisiting and coming back to Guatemala and our partnership there, and then the playbook or the roadmap that it would help us build for communities across Central and South America. So Amy asked, tell us about the Guatemala refugee accompaniment prison ashram project.
Well, combination of things.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm just reading exactly what I was told.
I don't know how those two things go together.
They were just listed.
I think she had two questions, but the first one was about the Guatemala refugee.
How it happened?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's what she's curious.
I'll just say that after many years of helping develop communities, redevelop communities who had been so affected by the violence there, there were, it was beginning to be peaceful, in quotes, enough that there's Ja and me, that many of the refugees who had fled to Mexico were able to come back into their villages, and they needed. The thing they were most afraid of was more violence, the army coming back into their communities and burning them down or doing all the violent things they had done the first time around. So the idea was to have a North American live in the village with people and first accompany them back on the journey across from Mexico, and then live in the village for some months while they got established, and make it much less likely that they would be vulnerable to violence. And so we trained quite a few people here in this country, and who then went down, and yeah. And it was kind of amazing. Yeah, I'm sitting here in Western Massachusetts, and we did a lot of the trainings right here in this room and then outside, and people had to imagine what they would do if, and then all these different circumstances. We all learned a lot from the trainings and then visiting the villages when people were there. It was really great.
Wow. There's a comment. This is a comment from Lisa Hartmeyer. Sorry if I hope I'm pronouncing your family name correctly, but she writes that she just reread or read, she just finished and reread Sometimes Brilliant and was blown away. She was happy to hear about the backstory, and she just wants you all to know that your gift to the world to restore sight is one of the biggest gifts possible, and she thanks you. One of your guests on the line today, once they wrote, they understand that a value proposition or one of the values of Seva is fun, and they want to know which one of you brought the fun.
Everyone. Everyone. Wavy mainly. Just in case we weren't having fun, Wavy made sure. But everybody brought it in lots of different ways. I'm wearing costumes and making the space beautiful and having great food and music, always music.
We always had time to play in a Seva meeting, and I think that we had to sort of go through the circle sharing, which was the beginning, and it could be more than a day, but there was always play. And I remember doing improv acting with Dr. V. Wavy brought him what he learned in the committee, and Shams brought Sufi dancing. And I remember Sir John Wilson, who was blind, doing Sufi dancing in the courtyard of a meeting. So the humor was there, but the play was there from all of us. And it's good to remember that, because we all Wavy that you have to have a sense of humor. And I think Wavy never lets us forget that. Thanks for being.
Even this photograph we're seeing, this is Seva's booth at the American Public Health Association meeting from the early 80s. And, there weren't that many organizations that had a clown at their booth, but he was a big hit and he loved it. And of course, he learned so much in the process. This guy is a sponge.
Well, speaking about that booth, maybe go ahead.
I think taking Dr. V backstage to a Grateful Dead concert that was a Seva benefit was always a memorable experience.
Actually, Girija, that's a question. I know that we'll talk more. Jahanra will be with us and Wavy will be with us as part of the originals at a future conversation. But someone on the line today wondered, well, how was the Grateful Dead received by Aravind? So could you tell us more about, Dr. V's reaction to the Grateful Dead?
Well, what he just turned to us and said, well, this is second chakra. And maybe that's the backstory, meaning he realized there was a really powerful energy coming out of the music. And I think Dr. V accepted everyone as they were. He was, however, incredibly single-pointed about his mission. And that's something that no one had to the extent that he and Nicole had, which is wherever you were with Dr. V, he was thinking about how could he get rid of more blindness. And every time he met someone, he was thinking, I wonder if they could help me in this project. And so I'm sure when he was listening to a Grateful Dead concert, he was backstage, he was probably looking around to see, who do you think I could talk to that might be able to help our work?
That's terrific. That's terrific. We have another question from Jeff Schurtz. It begins by, in service and social justice work, giving to the world, one ends up receiving so much more than we can give. We actually were talking about this theme before we started going live this morning. And Jeff wonders, can you talk more about what you have received personally? That's a good question. All of them are good questions.
Yeah. Well, I know for me, part of it is, and this is very useful right now, just having this reservoir of really positive experiences and seeing a lot of breakthroughs over the years with communities around the world gives me a lot of hope right now. We're in the middle of something that, for people who are viewing this 10 years from now and didn't hear about COVID-19, we're in month 7 or so of quite a lockdown around the world. And a lot of the hope I have, a lot of my optimism springs from knowing how hard so many people work day in and day out, almost under these same conditions. But for them, it's daily. Not having enough water, not having electricity, not being sure if the transport is going to run that day. It's kind of the human condition in much of the world. So brings me in closer contact with that. And I also, with Seva's work, it gives me such a sense of hope that people working together can really solve this.
Yeah. That's great.
Mirabai, you go. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I underscore everything Suzanne said. You know, what did I learn from Seva? Like everything. It's the ground of everything I've done since then. One thing was like it, having the support from everyone to like take some big risks. You know,
Yeah.
so often once you institutionalize an idea to make change, then it's very difficult after that to take risks, you know. And I mean, I think of how we committed to Guatemala. When we were there, there were no other development groups there. Oxfam grassroots, they had all left because there was so much violence. Their own people were getting killed. And we just got there through people we knew, and we found ourselves there, and we just fell in love with the people there and saw how much they were suffering and how really relatively easily we could really be a help. And but it was a huge risk. You know, the army was still in big control of the country. We didn't have any money for it. We were worried that we would repeat, and Suzanne brought this up in another text earlier. We were worried we would repeat the mistakes of the colonial influence past, you know, the North on the South. Yeah. And it's the last thing we wanted to do. So, you know, we did that, and we helped each other, and we learned as we went. I had to learn Spanish in my 50s. That wasn't easy. And ever since we did it, and it worked, you know. And since then, I have been much more willing to take risks in order to make change that I really believed in.
That's fantastic.
That's a really important message. And I think we think back, there was a time in Seva when the stock market crashed, and there was...
I was treasurer.
And we discovered that all of our savings and Seva's net worth had plummeted in a matter of hours. And so we just moved forward, and Seva's supporters never left us. No matter how bad the economy was, they kept sending small donations. And I think that's one of the most inspiring things, that good people really will resonate in hard times.
Yes.
And I think these are one of the hard times. I think there are more centrifugal forces now trying to tear us apart.
Yeah.
It didn't exist when we were starting Seva. It didn't exist 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So people working today have such a bigger challenge. There's so many more variables they have to contend with. And that's where having hope, having determination, having good friendships really are the things that will sustain all of us going forward.
And I want to remember the mystery in it. Yesterday I was listening to Larry on Marketplace, and I realized, like, Maharaji sent him to be part of smallpox, and then you all got engaged in smallpox. And that was an important thing to do, but look how much it's influenced what's happening now. And the wisdom that Larry's been able to bring, many people have, but he's been on in the media, that was learned then. But nobody then ever thought we'd be in this situation today. I shouldn't say that. A lot of epidemiologists were the ones who knew that it was coming, but we didn't see that. So I always like to think of, like, what is it we're doing now that someday is going to have another impact that we can't see now.
Yeah. Well, I think people are channeling your wonderment, Mirabai, because Bobby Taylor just wrote in and asked, you know, is it possible that the consciousness and spirit of Seva could permeate American corporations and society at large so that one day the world could be better?
I think we should just say yes. No, I spent 25 years on that one, you know, with the Center for Contemplative Mind. And definitely there are possibilities, but it hasn't happened yet.
So what were some of the crazy decisions that you had that come to mind? Is there something that just pops out for you of either a crazy or you talked about needing to make big or bold or brave decisions, like Guatemala, I think clearly was one of them. Is there something else that comes to mind for the three of you or for you individually?
A board meeting we had in Western Massachusetts early on, and Seva was almost completely broke. And we were asked as a board to approve a budget that would require spending money we didn't have. And that's when we just took that leap, feeling that sense of magic or faith. And then almost immediately there was a phone call from a donor in Kentucky offering the money that we needed to do that. And so that was like a totem to us. And every time in the future, we had to trust that what we needed would materialize. And John used to say, and she used the word magic to stand for all the spiritual forces and the unknowable things that could happen. She would say when magic would come and live in the Seva circle when you needed it. And if Seva didn't need it, it would move on to another place. So that's always inspired me.
I love that.
I think another very early example was when Seva, with a lot of work by Nicole Grasse, managed to raise $500,000 in our first year or two from the government of Netherlands to use for the Nepal blindness program through WHO. And rather than using those funds to piecemeal offer services or start to do something that would be very short-lived, instead, Seva, along with WHO and Nepal government, invested that $500,000 in a national survey that helped us understand the causes and location of blinding conditions in the country, helped develop a plan for training, launch that training, helped develop a recruitment plan that then Nicole and Dr. R.P. Pokral in Nepal used to recruit other donors from other parts of the world to put in millions of dollars toward establishing a strong foundation and infrastructure for eye care services in Nepal, which carries on today. So we could have spent that enormous amount of money very quickly in a way that was going to be very serviceful, but not build legs for the future. Instead, we somehow managed to use those resources for long-term benefit that helps many more people.
And today, this was the very first national survey of blindness ever to be done anywhere in the world. And it's still held up as an example of really good science, doing a good survey in a very difficult setting. And so Seva should be very, very proud that it was so instrumental in that.
I thought of something else about those years that was important, which was that we had made this commitment to, now we all smile when we say it, end blindness in 5 years in Nepal, right? And I don't think we rolled India in at the time, but we might have, but in Nepal. And of course, as we started approaching that 5-year deadline, it was very clear that that wasn't going to happen. But you know, Seva we didn't like pack up and say, we tried to do that one, it didn't work, let's do something else. We just re-looked at it, you know, and recognized that, you know, in good faith, we had made this plan, as we all do. We all set out like goals, and it didn't work out the way we thought it was going to. So we just regrouped and looked at it in a different way and went forward. And I think that's an important lesson for the future of all of us and for other organizations as well.
Yeah, I think that's being taken forward a lot in terms of, yes, Girija?
In the beginning, we said we'd never want to build a hospital that have our name on it. That's the last thing we want to do. And one of the things we realized is that we were going to have to build an eye hospital in Nepal. And even though our name wasn't on it, as Mira said, sometimes you do whatever it takes to get to your goal.
Mm-hmm. But yeah. I think this legacy has stood Seva in very good stead all these decades later. Just the fact that we're able to take these early lessons learned that we're hearing about from India, Nepal, Guatemala. We've been able to learn the essential lessons from that work, and then apply it and build on it in our work with partners now in more than 20 countries around the world. It's true that we're now focusing a great deal on sight restoration and blindness prevention, whereas in early years we may have had a more, as they say, diversified program portfolio. We're also working in arenas in blindness prevention and restoring vision that we just never, ever could dream of doing several decades ago. Again, this is the power of partnership, and it's the power of leverage and connection. And I think we've been very fortunate to have so many donors who followed us through this journey, partners, some of whom, like Aravind and the Nepal program, have been with us for 40 plus years, and some very new partners that are just coming on board over the last few months. So it's, I find that very gratifying. Those early lessons laid a groundwork.
That's great. Well, let me give you one last question before unfortunately, our time is almost up, but I do have one parting question for the three of you, and that is, we've talked a lot today, Seva in many ways was a startup before the terminology startup was even maybe used. And what advice would you give to someone who's starting their career in the impact space today?
Well, I would say the key thing is to surround yourself with people who are passionate and knowledgeable and want to get something done. Learn from them. Be humble. Put yourself where people are doing interesting work that you can really get behind, because if it clicks, you may find yourself doing it for decades. So to me, it's a lot about people, their passion, and the alignment. There's so much to get done in the world. As Johanna used to say, and still does, if everyone did something, it would all get done. So this is what we're here to promote.
Yeah, add to that, being committed to doing things in the long term, that it takes years and decades to do things and not always short term, and having that long view is so important. Startups have the idea of getting it all done now, and sometimes it's a different point of view of really accepting the fact that it may take 5 or 10 years or more than that, and we may not be around to see the results of what we started now. So that's important.
I would say make sure you're acting from your heart, from your deepest values, because that will sustain you over time. Learn to listen even better than you're able to now. If you're initiating something, you actually are starting something up. Start small until you know what the essential challenges of that area, and then grow. And do your homework. Like when we entered Guatemala, we had to do a lot of homework to find out not to make mistakes others had made. And stay awake to the suffering of others, and and listen to compassion. Listen to, as if you're drawn to relieve that suffering, to do it in a way that's really going to help. And keep reflecting on what you're doing. Don't be attached to there's a question people ask, and when they're doing strategic planning after 20 years, like, if you were starting the organization today, what would you do? So keep that open, like we had to after the 5 years. And and don't be afraid to take the leap, to risk it, because you'll learn. Even if it doesn't work, as most startups don't, you'll learn from it and look forward to do something better. That's what I have to say.
I think that's probably the best way to conclude this first of what will be many conversations with originals. The three of you more than live up to the term. Your humility, you've surrounded yourselves with people that matter to you. You've helped ground the equity and commitment to kind of contemplative love and service in that wonderful, good science. there's a whole group of us today that now call Seva part of our origin story, and we are very grateful to the work and to the fact that we get to stand on your shoulders, but also work together shoulder to shoulder with you. I want to thank you on a personal note because this has been one of the most rewarding aspects of both my personal and my professional life, has been an opportunity to get to know each of you a little better and to try and steward and be part of the Seva legacy as we start to imagine what it's going to look like in the years to come. And millions of people are now living very different lives because of your ideas from 40 years ago and from your hard work through the decades. So thank you doesn't cover it, but it's really the best I've got. So thank you very, very much for who you are, for your talents. Those of you that have taken time to join us today, thank you very much. Stay tuned for more original conversations to come, and please enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye. Bye.